So I'm going to talk about the poetic devices that show up in the first 33 lines of the Aeneid. And your responsibility is going to be threefold. Number one, you need to be able to define what the poetic device is. Number two, you have to be able to recognize it in the passage. And then number three, where possible, you should consider, why Virgil chose to use this particular rhetorical or poetic device. Sometimes the answer will be obvious. Sometimes the answer might just be for metrical purposes. And sometimes the answer you can just kind of speculate on. So I'm going to cover kind of number one and number two. And then the third thing is something for you to kind of ponder and we can discuss. So the first word of the Aeneid, arma, is an example of metonymy. Metonymy is a device that the author uses one word, but it refers to another one. And in this case, arma, weapons, is metonymy for war. So you could translate it, either arms and a man or, war and a man. The next poetic device is one that the AP College Board doesn't require you to know, but it's one of my favorites, which is polyptyton. And it is the occurrence of the same word in different forms. So as you might imagine, it'll usually be nouns or adjectives in different cases or verbs in different forms. So here we have multum, which is neuter accusative, kind of acting adverbially, and then multa, which is neuter accusative plural, which is the direct object of posse. This is a word picture, and this is one of those word pictures that my students in the past have said it's a bit of a stretch. This is showing him being tossed on land and on sea, and I picture it kind of as this GIF shows that he's being bounced back and forth from land and sea. Take it as you will. I've recently learned that the AP College Board does not expect you to answer word picture for any questions on rhetorical devices, but I think they're really nice to point out, and there's some pretty cool ones that we'll see in the course of the year. This is an example of syncope, which is interlocked word order, and here sci-y modifies unonits, so that's the A's, and memorem modifies eram, those are the B's, so it goes A, B, A, B, as you can see with the color scheme. And then the last line and a half of these lines is what's called an ascending tricolon. So tricolon is just a list of three things. And what makes it ascending is that the final element here, altai, moinia, romi, is the most important. So Rome here is the most important thing. Sometimes an ascending tricolon will just, the last item will be described more fully and just be longer, but in this case, it's that Rome is the pinnacle and everything else is leading to that. You could also argue it's ascending chronologically as well. So first it's the Latin race, then Alba Longa was founded, then it's the walls of Rome. A few more with these lines. Vi superum is enjambment, which is saving kind of an important thing to another line. So we find out, he suffered a lot, he's tossed about, and then we find out why, because of the force of the gods. One could argue that sci-y, memorum, and altai are both transferred epithets. So what that means, an epithet is just an adjective or a description. So when it's transferred, it means it grammatically modifies one thing, but it might make more sense for it to modify something else or describe something else. So sci-y here modifies eunonis, which is savage Juno, which makes plenty of sense. Memorem, though, means mindful or unforgetting, and it modifies eram, so unforgetting anger. And we know what that means. That means anger that just won't go away. But it might make more sense for the anger to be savage and for Juno to be the one that's unforgetting. So it's not that memorem doesn't describe eram or sci-y doesn't describe eunonis, but it almost does double duty. I feel like, sci-y kind of covers both nouns and memorem covers both nouns. And then in this seventh line, altai, it's the walls of high Rome, but it would make more sense to have high walls. Anastrophe is just kind of odd word order, and usually it's going to be with prepositions that are, kind of in an odd place. So the fact that ob comes to, a word after memorem is unusual. And then et, the fact that et is delayed a little bit, that is also an example of anastrophe. Because Latin word order is so flexible, anastrophe is sometimes tough to identify. So it's usually prepositions in weird places or delayed conjunctions. On line 8, we're on to Musa apostrophe. That is kind of speaking to an entity that is not necessarily present and you don't really expect a response to. So he's invoking the muse here. We've got a nice little alliteration at the beginning, Musa mihi memora. Syncope is a shortened form of the word, and you'll see it a lot in Virgil with the genitive orum ending being shrink down to just the deorum is deum here. And then we'll see another example of a common example of syncope coming up. These two phrases, tot volvere casus, are, let's say, an anaphora first. So the repetition of the tot is anaphora. Asyndeton because there's no conjunction between the two, and then a parallel structure having tot and then the infinitive and then the direct object. So that's, very deliberate placing at the end of the line there. In Pooler, it's another example of enjambment. Just, you get the whole idea of the sentence, who's mad, he underwent so many labors and disasters, and then what's going to be the main verb? And it's going to be in Pooler. It's not she invited him to or she asked him to, she forced him to. And then this is an example of chiasmus. So it's ABBA order, and it's because tantai modifies iri and caelestibus modifies animis. And you could also argue that there's an ellipsis here, which is just a word being left out, and there should be a sunt there. So are there such angers in divine spirits? Antiqua is an anachronism. We've talked about the fact that Carthage wasn't founded till the 9th century BCE, but Virgil's telling the story and it's taking place after 1200 in the 1200s or 1100s BCE. So the fact that he even calls, the fact that Carthage even exists is an anachronism, and especially the fact that it's an ancient city is definitely an anachronism, like a break in the temporal force of this story. Tenuere is an example of the second most common use of syncope in Virgil's Aeneid, which is the ere ending is put there instead of erunt. It's third person plural perfect. The e will always be long, the first e. And this is done 100% for metrical issues because tenuerunt, that unt has to be long. And so if in the meter, there can't be a long syllable, it'll be shortened to tenuere because that's a short e, the last e is. Carthago Italiam and omnibus unam are both examples of juxtaposition. This is the kind of placement of two very often opposing or contrasting things next to each other. Obviously, Carthago, Italiam are next to each other physically in this line, but they are enemies. And then omnibus unam, that just calls attention to the omnibus, the allness, and then this one place is more cherished than that. Contra is another example of anastrophe. It's coming after Italiam. And then the hic ilias arma, hic chorus, that's an example again. The hic repetition is anaphora, and then there's asyndeton because there's no conjunction between that. In contrast, tenditque, fovetque, that's polysyndeton, even though it's just two ands, so it doesn't seem over the top. That is a kind of what's called an epic polysyndeton, and you'll see that a lot. And then finally, in this segment of text, that middle line has the line framing of the fact that quam, unam modifies quam, and they're so spread out. And then it's also an example of chiasmus because unam modifies quam, that's the A, and then I mistyped this on this, but it should be teres omnibus, that's the B, omnibus modifies teres. Another anastrophe, sed, is delayed after progenium there. Audierat is a syncope where the central consonant is kind of squished out, so that should be audierat, but that V fell out. And then venturum is an example of ellipsis because you have to supply an essay. So very often forms of to be are left out and just have to be assumed. And this is one example, and we'll see a lot of those. Here we've got chiasmus. Veterus modifies belly, so those are the A's, and then memor modifies Saturnia. Those are the B's in the middle. And then here we've got an example of anastrophe. The circum comes after Maria Omnia. And that's it.